Welcome back. We continued with the first session, and now the speaker will be Adam T. Sellen. And Adam is a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mérida, Yucatan. He's a specialist in pre-Hispanic cultures and has written on a variety of themes relating to 19th century archaeological collecting and the origins of Mexican museums. He has also written on collecting practices in the peninsula of Yucatan and the genesis of museums in that particular region. His current project is about Zapotec material culture in the collections of the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Canada. Let me just tell you before I give the word to Adam, he's a very much respected scholar in Mexico. I recently read in a magnificent book called Past Presented about his article on photographic archaeological collections in Mexico in the 19th century. It's a superb academic job. Please, Adam.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I hope you don't lose your respect for me by the time this is over. Well, I'm really honored to be here among you all, friends, colleagues, public, and I thank from the bottom of my heart all the people who organized this conference, especially Kim, and Aleka, Elena, and Thomas Gaken. It's really a delight. Oh, I have to do something here. Let's see. Start. Here we are. Well, I'll start. Inextricable confusion and utter neglect. That's how the American Brant Smeyer described the collection of Mexico's National Museum in 1840. Now, he wasn't the only foreigner to grumble about the experience of visiting this museum. And it wasn't just that the objects were in these chaotic jumbles, and here I have a sort of an example of that. It's a bit of an unfair example because it's not 1840. It's a lithograph that's obviously a composition, but I think you kind of get the idea of what things looked like around that time and period. So it wasn't the only criticism at that time was that things were chaotic, but also that really the experience of visiting this museum was difficult because you couldn't get an idea of representative collections from the other parts of the country. As you can see from this image, most of it was really from the center of Mexico. So to see things from the peripheral regions of Mexico, you had to visit the state museums. And sometimes these were worth the visits if they existed at all, and sometimes they weren't. But what everybody knew was that the private collections were actually the places to go to see really interesting material, and everyone knew it. And this is my example. In 1895, the Congress of Americas, held in Oaxaca, they made their official visit not to the State Museum, but rather to the private collection of Fernando Salaguren, a medical doctor. And to give you sort of an idea of the significance of his holding, in 1907, the National Museum acquired all his collection, and today it represents over half of what is currently on view in the Oaxaca wing of that museum. So that's a lot of material culture. So while many public museums had been around in Mexico for the better part of the 19th century, it was really the private cabinets that held the greatest wealth of the country's natural and historical heritage. And I'm not just talking about archaeological heritage. And I would say, too, that it's crucial to understand that many of these important private collections didn't migrate into the public museums until well into the 20th century. So for most of the time, most of the 19th century, you really had these two realities. You had these anemic national and state museums, and you had these very well, robust private collections. So I guess my point is that we can't really talk about the beginnings of Mexican museum without understanding the principal activity that made these institutions possible, which was collecting. And more to the point, and I don't think we've really studied sufficiently the nature of these collectors and their private cabinets. We tend to study museums and the final destination of those collections, but not the activity that brought them there. Yet the role of the collector in the development of the museum was paramount. And not just because these institutions needed objects, they did, they needed ideas. And that was something that was coming from a lot of these collectors. In 19th century Mexico, just remember, it's a country that's beset by conflict, extreme poverty, and that principal idea, I think, or at least that is one of my little pet theses, was modernity. That's sort of a complex conglomerate of ways of thinking and acting. It's a rejection of the past, it's a rejection of certain traditions, but for the purposes of my argument, I would say that it was a new way of thinking and acting in the sense that it was guided by the belief expressed in scientific discourse that objective reality existed and that human beings could share and appreciate this reality through empirical data. So just imagine if, a ramble through a museum or a private collection was that experience. You were experiencing the empirical data. A very positive point of view. And this is a very interesting collector too. Of course, he's not a local Mexican collector. He's Edward Saylor, who was the curator at the Ethnographic Museum. I'm sure Viola's going to talk more about him. But what's fascinating about him is that he didn't really excavate at all. He just collected. So he would contact all these local collectors on the ground. He had a great ability to do that. And then he would just, bring all this material out of the country and into the cabinets in Germany. Now, the makers of these first cabinets are really the interesting part of the story, to extend and accommodate these systems of knowledge to the material of past lives. And I think in most cases, the information we have about the first collectors is really sparse, if it exists at all. We know very little. We only have a snapshot of their lives and almost nothing usually about what they thought. But some generalities are possible, and I think one of them is that almost always the major collectors and founders of the first museums in Mexico were priests, as we can see just by these four fellows here. And that sort of maybe, it seems a little odd, I guess, if we just think about priests in Mexico and archaeological objects. What comes to mind is them, sitting around destroying them all the time and bragging about it. And that was happening at the same time. There were actually priests doing that at the same time that these priests were making their first collections. And so it must have been a very tense, bizarre time in Mexico when that was occurring. But I think this tells us a lot about who the collectors were in the sense that they were clergy. Why were the clergy so present in collecting in Mexico at the time? And actually their presence is seen all the way through the 19th century. And I think that the solution to that problem is fairly easy. It's because they were the well-read ones, they were well-traveled, and they just had the time to do it, whereas most other people didn't. Now, I think, so while the presence of collectors and priests and others is a constant throughout the century, most of the major works on the history of archaeology completely ignore their contributions. It's rare to read a history of archaeology where we talk about these collectors in any sense that is, well, I would say even flattering. They tend to just talk about them and say, well, the 19th century collecting spree was an amateurish, it was amateur hour, and it ended, with a total and permanent victory for academic and professional archaeology. That's that's really what the line is. And I think Bernal, who's fantastic with his book, but he dedicated a whole chapter to that. The triumph of the potsherd, right? So I think. The triumph of science is what he's saying. And I think while it's true that, the discipline was moving away from an object-oriented antiquarian approach to material culture, but towards a more theoretical one, it's also true that there was this new breed of collector that was coming onto the scene in the 20th century. And I cite the American Robert Woods Bliss and his exquisite collection at Dumbarton Oaks. And he was an amazing collector in the sense that, he had deep pockets. So he could buy anything he wanted. And he would buy things that he thought were just exquisitely beautiful. And then if he saw something else that was sort of like it in the same category, but more beautiful, he would sell the other thing and he'd stick with that. So he made really a fantastic collection that was based on aesthetics, let's say it. And he did a lot to promote objects as pre-Hispanic objects as art objects. Now, excuse me. Professional archaeologists have a very dim view of these collectors. They really think them as the unthinking consumerists who perpetuate an immoral trade that encourages the ruthless removal of antiquities from their sites, right? But of course, there's the other argument, which is that collectors resent that because they perceive that they're being sort of getting in the way of this age-old pursuit of connoisseurship, right? And this is an ongoing debate that they've been having for years. It's very antagonistic, it's very virulent. It's fun to watch. But I think that from my perspective, it's a debate that has unfairly tainted our view of the past, of what came before. And I think it's really crucial to distinguish the 20th century collectors from their 19th century predecessors. And to do that, I'd like to offer up this little object here. This is a patojo. It's called that because it looks like a pato or a duck, right? And I would say this is very pre-processing ceramic vessel. It's from Oaxaca. They're still made by local potters in Oaxaca. They're very interesting in their design because that little sort of bit that comes out the end is made to sort of plug in underneath a comal where they make tortillas, and that's how you heat up your coffee. So it's a fantastic little piece of design, I'm sure made by a woman. And this one comes from the Oaxacan collector Manuel Martinez Gracida, and you can see, how his label, he lovingly labeled this piece very carefully, preserved the information about it. And when I find that to be quite remarkable, in the sense that, nowadays an object such as this, it's tough to find them in a museum because, let's face it, it's really not that sort of object that they like to portray in museums anymore. We get the Mayan painted vases, the Teotihuacan censers. You're not going to find this humble little patojo in the museum context necessarily. But in the 19th century, they were collecting scores and scores of these things and finding them all over the place in Oaxaca. And not just those, but of course you can see this is all domestic, really, pottery. And it was entering in the collections in the same rate that, the fantastic urns and censers were being collected at the same time. So this was all happening, around 1875. There was this group of collectors in Oaxaca, local guys. Most of them were well-to-do, medics, historians, etc. And they formed this little archaeological club to collect. And this is a picture of them here in 1895, sitting on Monte Alban. It's a fascinating picture because you can identify many of the collectors in the photograph. But right in the middle, there's Edward Saylor and his wife, Cecilia Saylor Sachs. And behind him, I think, and Viola probably will be able to tell us more, I think it's the consul from Germany. And they're all having this little picnic. But it tells us so much more about what was going on, all these intricacies of relationships at the time. In fact, really, what Saylor was trying to do with all these collectors was buy all their collections. I mean, if he could get his hands on them, he would. But they didn't want to sell. They were not interested at that point in selling, which is an interesting fact. Now, what about these collectors? I've been looking at them very carefully and trying to get information about them and what they thought about their collections. It's very hard. But what I do know about them is that they, as a group, categorized and classified all the material they had in their hands. And this is fascinating. They made their own cataloging system, these little printed labels, and everything was very carefully cataloged, classified. They talked about its provenience, where it was from, when it was found. And that all corresponded to these wonderful inventory lists that you could look up the piece on the list, and there was the label, and so then you knew where the piece was from. That was a really basic methods that archaeologists today still use. Some of them don't even do it that well. But I'd like to say that, I really look at that as something being this like proto-archaeology right here. So what I would say then is that what distinguished these collectors from their predecessors and from many of their successors was their interest in the entire spectrum of ancient Mexican material culture, rather than that narrowly defined aesthetic segment of it. And by the way, what's interesting is that many of these objects that have the labels on them are no longer the objects that you can actually find in Mexico, because the ones that stayed in Mexico in the National Museum, for some reason the conservators there are very overzealous, and they ripped all the labels off. And so now we don't really know where the pieces are from. But the ones that went to museums such in Germany or in Sweden or et cetera, and they are still intact, which is great. So I just wanted to say that the role of these Mexican collectors in particular, these local guys in Oaxaca and other places, has been really overlooked in academic research. And this started a long time ago. This is an example. Walter Lehmann, who was a student of Edward Sayler's, he said this. He said, well, the days have gone by when archaeologists thought it was sufficient to collect and potsherds, clay figurines, but they weren't concerned about where the things came from, right? And it says only much later did the travelers, and think foreigners, because obviously that's what he's talking about, began to take these careful notes and to look at where every piece came from and then classify them according to locality. Well, I mean, this in the face of what I just showed you, I think is a great contradiction, especially since we know that Sayler bought these local collectors' collections, right? I mean, he bought them directly off them. And so he wasn't just acquiring the collection, he was getting all that information that they had very carefully over the years written down. And so it was all classified, to the standards of the day, right? But it was all beautifully classified, and it was all basically in order, right? So I think that Lehmann is doing a great disservice. I think he's trying to, pull up his teacher, obviously, because Sayler was very important in classifying ceramic categories, etc. But he's playing down, very obviously, the role that the actual Mexicans played in all that. So I think that when we consider these proto-archaeologists and their collection in a historical context, I think they really deserve to be thought of as, very capable scientists, right? In contrast to actually many of them that followed. Now, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'd like to talk about the collectors and how they became involved with the creation of public museums in Mexico. In the 19th century, public museums were believed to be true agents of change that promised a pathway to a more civilized nation with peace and prosperity, because this type of institution, they thought, well, it would cement a sense of identity and belonging to the country. Well, I think we've seen that in many of the papers we've already talked about that aspect. But I'd also like just to point out that really in the 19th century, especially early on in the century, not everyone had a sense of what that nation should look like in Mexico. I think very few people did, as a matter of fact. And so the small regional museums that were cropping up around the country, they often ended up being co-opted by these broader national interests that were not, and their view, of course, wasn't necessarily shared by that view of Chapultepec, right? And a case in point is this little museum. It's actually not the picture of the museum. It was probably on that street, so you get an idea. It was founded around 1830 by the brothers Leandro and Jose Maria Camacho in Campeche, a port city of the Gulf of Mexico. And I just want to say, at that time, Campeche was actually part of Yucatan. It was still all one entity. They were Spanish priests with very limited resources, and their cabinet was really the first of the kind in the region. It was the first in the country to exhibit what would really be considered Mayan culture, for example. And they created this museum out of, having visited Europe. They visited all the great museums of Europe. And they had their model, I guess, in that idea. And as Irina mentioned, they collected everything from shells to little piece of sand from beaches. All kinds of things were in that museum. And of course, because of that reason, it was really an obligatory visit for anybody who came to Campeche at that time. And a lot of people did. Campeche was a port, so you had invading generals. They would stop their invasion just to go to visit the museum sometimes. You had all kinds of travelers and adventurers that were going by there and leaving these little snippets of information about the museum and what it was like, because the Camacho brothers never wrote anything about it. No, there's nothing published. And we don't even know what they looked like, which is bizarre. So often the people would say, well, this place is chaotic. It looks like a necromancer's workshop. A Scottish traveler, he said, there's a lot of richness in the objects here, but really, the priests themselves are really the most interesting artifacts. So you can imagine what that kind of experience was like visiting this place. Now, the Camachos, I think, they're from Spain. They didn't have a lot of money. I think they were just really totally illuminated priests who were interested in collecting, for trying to be modern, as I would say. But the most fervent, really, supporter of this museum was a fellow. Oh, sorry, that's not him. That's another fellow. That's actually, I have to mention this. This is another daguerreotype that was in the hands of the Camachos. We have very few objects from their original collection. But this is one of them, and it's such a beautiful object because it is the first photograph of a Mayan artifact that exists right there. We don't know what happened to this artifact, but the daguerreotype is presently now in Vienna in a museum. And here's another example of somebody who went to the museum. It's Colonel Dutrelain, who was from the French scientific expedition, and started to draw the objects in the museum and made this fantastic study called Priapephalas, on the phallic nature of all these all the artifacts in the priest's museum. And I wonder what they thought about that, right? We don't know. So anyway, here's O'Reilly. He's a very interesting guy. He was sort of considered the father of Yucatecan literature, and famously, Sierra O'Reilly tried to separate the state of Yucatan from the rest of Mexico. Right? He tried and he failed. But in doing that, his whole plan was that he would create basically this whole historical background for his project, including statues, libraries, his literary journals, and museums. And the Camacho Museum would be at the centerpiece of that sort of memory project to get everybody together on his political bandwagon, right? As we're going to create a nation by doing this. Well, his project fell through, of course. The Camacho brothers died, and the collection was dispersed. But I think it's interesting that these projects existed at the time, and that there was really a sense that yes, we want to make our own history here, right? And it has nothing to do necessarily with that national history that is being imposed upon us. So this was a great setback, of course, for the region, that there was no longer a museum. But it didn't stop the Yucatecs from desiring their own museum. And eventually, in Mérida, a Museo Yucateco was established in 1871. About this museum we know a lot, because it's just beautifully well documented in the archives. And that's totally different from other museums, state museums in Mexico, where we know almost nothing. The museum in Oaxaca, for example, all the information about it in the archives was placed under a bleacher in a baseball game, and somebody threw a cigarette on it, and it just burned away. So there's nothing we know about that museum, very little. But here we do, and I think that's so interesting, because we can really dig into what they were thinking about the beginning of this museum at the time. And I want to focus on one particular artifact that was in this museum, and I found it on an inventory list. It was the first artifact on the inventory list, and you know when you do an inventory, usually you start at the beginning, so I figure it was the first object that you saw in the museum when you walked in, and it was this, and I will translate. 2 fragments of bread that served as food for the French during the last period of the siege of Paris. So, that's an interesting thing. This is a reminder that the siege of Paris occurred in 1870, when the Prussian army surrounded the city and tried to starve the French into submission. After 4 months of privation, the Parisians began to eat anything they could get their hands on, pets, vermin, sadly the animals at the zoo. This was really a lousy day to take your kids to the zoo, by the way. You see that they're freaked out, you know. So in this situation of great need, how did these precious morsels of bread end up in a faraway museum? And all we know really is that they were donated to the Museo Yucateco by this wealthy Yucatec, Rodolfo Canton, and that they were in the museum on display for 30 years. And I just mind-boggling, especially in Mérida, that was really stale, moldy bread. But I guess the question is, why was it on display at all, right? What was it about the French experience that intrigued these peninsular Mexicans? Well, we know, we've talked about it, that the Latin American oligarchs were fascinated by all things French, everything from their parks, promenades, the latest men's, women's fashion. But specifically, the oligarchs of Yucatan were interested in the French resistance to the siege because earlier, in 1848, at the height of the caste war, a 50-year conflict, the white elites of Mérida also found themselves surrounded, not by Prussians, but by angry Mayans, who threatened their very existence. So thus we can perhaps interpret the bread displays as sort of shared suffering. But I think on a deeper level, I think it's a strong statement of alignment to French culture and what that represented. And they really thought that the French were this beacon of modern ideals and institutions. And the French were also the architects of the public museum. And that successful model was constantly being talked about in the Yucatec press as one to emulate. And they would often refer to it in terms of as a useful, an honorable, a beneficial institution. So during the height of the caste war, the embattled elites of Mérida sought to erect this diversity of institutions, including the museum, as barriers against a society that was really being torn apart by conflict. And this notion was very melodramatically illustrated by Pastor Esquivel in 1861. And I think it's a beautiful passage where he says, well, our civilization progress marches on, and despite the horrors of all the war, and he talks about the sounds of the cannon and people shrieking and dying, you can hear the muses singing sweetly above that. And the muses, of course, are connected to the museum, right? So, in a sense, the Museo Yucateco was a bastion for their culture, you might say. This is where they would be sort of like them against the barbarous hordes. And it, unfortunately, also came to symbolize a complete domination of the indigenous population, evidenced by the war trophies that were kept in the museum. This is no longer in that museum, but they had things like this. It was the skull of a murdered indigenous rebel leader, Fernandez Sen. And they had that, and they had his machete, they had his clothes, and so this was really a war trophy in the context of the museum. Now, of course, embracing this new modern world meant eradicating these rebellious Indians, right? Which they did by the dozen, right? And ironically, they also collected and exhibited the pre-Hispanic past. So how is it that you're eradicating the Indians on one hand, but at the same time you're collecting this great past and you're showing it in the museums? Well, that's because they were convinced that the actually contemporary Mayans were not the makers of that past. They had no connection to it whatsoever. And that it was really the Toltecs, some faraway group who came and then left, who made these great pyramids and all these things. Because how is it possible that these barbarous Indians could have done anything like that? So basically, they denied them their history completely, right? And they said to themselves, well, this is our history. This is part of our history. And unfortunately, and I'm going to say this, I think those attitudes persist in Yucatan. For many years, I don't know if you visited, but this is like an obligatory stop in the city of Mérida. Palacio Canton, was the main archaeological museum in Yucatan. And this symposium building, it also happens to be the former house of General Francisco Canton, there he is, who, since he was 16 years old, he spent most of his life eradicating Mayans, right, in the caste war. And at the end of his life, he was rewarded with the governorship of the state, became, horrendously wealthy because, all of a sudden all those haciendas were in those conquered indigenous territories were his, and built this fantastic house, and it's, with Carrera marble, and it's unbelievable. It's just something else. So it's a little bit strange for me to walk in there and see exhibitions on Mayan culture. I just put it in context. Would we here in General Custer's house put a museum that was dedicated to the material culture of the Great Sioux Nation? I don't think so, but it'd be interesting to try. That's just from a museological point of view. So I think, and I mention this to people all the time, and it doesn't really sink in, and I guess it's because the domination was just so complete, right? That people just don't really think about these things anymore. Well, throughout this talk, I've underlined, I think, that people began to collect and make museums in Mexico because they wanted to be modern in their outlook. But we don't normally associate museums with modernity. We always think of them, well, they're sort of dusty places, holding old things. But the interesting thing is that almost always when they're founded, that concept is constantly repeated. And in Mérida, recently, another museum was founded in 2002. This was really built to replace Palacio Canton, and as an effort really to attract more tourism to the city. Didn't really work. And at the grand opening, the governor, Yvonne Ortega, said this. She said, well, today it is time to finish well what we began well. A modern cultural space on the cutting edge that inside will house and exhibit some of the greatest treasures of this land. Well, I think that's interesting. I was there when this was said, and I wanted to sort of raise my hand. You can't do that, but because it's very obvious that the museum is not finished, You can see in the background. But what was finished was her term as governor. And therefore, she rushed there to inaugurate these sort of naked steel girders. And sadly, I think this sums up the modern museum in Mexico, not all of them, but some of them, and other places in Latin America. And specifically, they're thinking about doing this thing in Guatemala that's very similar to this. They're mostly political projects that rely on technology and the splashy architecture to make them modern. And they really ignore the content that's inside of them. So, and there's another aspect of this, is that if being modern in the 21st century means anything, it's spending way more money than you have. This museum is completely draining the state because of how much money it costs. I mean, people don't even have an idea. They can't even cover the regular day-to-day workings of it. So it's a massive white elephant, and it really does little, I think, to contribute to the identity, the education, or the well-being of the Yucatec citizen. So now, I think, in the end, we're a long way, of course, with this, from the curious cabinets and museums of the 19th century Mexican collector. And while many things have been improved on the way, it really does feel, though, that the Anthropological Museum and how they represent the past is in a bit of a crisis, in part because of these things. And this, in part, too, I think, is because they're completely blind to their own history as institutions. Rarely does a museum in Mexico talk about itself. And I think, well, perhaps there's a reason for that. I mean, in the Yucatec context, because some of those stories are not very inspirational, right? But I don't think that's a problem. I think they're still interesting, and I think that it's probably worth more introspection in the next museums. Not looking to that next technological advance, but looking inside, looking at your own history as an institution. And I think, even if we tell it those stories with warts and all, I think that is what the truly modern attitude would be. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Adam. There will be a period now of 30 minutes, more or less, for discussions. And we would like you to participate, questioning, and be part of this symposium, please. So we are open to your questions, and we'll begin with whoever you want to ask of.
Lord Elgin's situation remains controversial, more so than the Maudsley situation with those lintels. Am I right about that, number one? And number two, why do you think that is?
Well, it depends who you talk to. Yes, well, in part because I think in the Elgin case, he had a firman, right? I mean,
He did, but it was signed by an oppressor.
Okay, but he had something. And in the case of Maudsley, at that time, Yashik land, it wasn't clear if it was part of Mexico, if it was part of Guatemala. So he took advantage of that sort of gray area at the time in order to do this. Of course, afterwards, they were furious, right? But then it was done, and it was really hard to, you don't want to get into a pissing match with Britain, because they'll send the boats over. At that time, that was still a concern, right?
Sure, and there was that colony, the British Honduras. Right.
Exactly. During the Porfiriato, they were trying to put a lid on all that kind of activity, exactly by appointing an inspector. But at the same time, they had an openness to foreign investment and to foreign ideas and people traveling to the country. So you had to stop it before it happened, because once it happened, really there wasn't much you could do about it from that perspective.
But there does seem to be far fewer protests about the lintels than there ever is today about the.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, but in part because I would say, look at where the protests are about Mexican cultural material outside of Mexico. The only one I can really think of where it's being consistent and ongoing is Moctezuma's headdress, right? I mean, everybody's upset about that. Do you really want that back? I mean, it doesn't look so great anymore. They have a fantastic reproduction in the museum. But that's where it's really, that's a question of nationality, right? That's something that we need to have that back. Yeah. So it's a very selective. You're right. I mean, I think people have very selective memories about those kinds of things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my question is also for Adam, and I guess I have two parts to my question. The first part is that we know that there's a vibrant intellectual movement among indigenous peoples throughout Latin America, but in Mexico. And have they developed critiques of museums and the display of artifacts that would be in any way equivalent to the movement in the United States to establish indigenous curatorial practices? So that's one part. And then secondly, I'm aware that in Oaxaca, there have been the creation of regional museums in communities again. And so how might those kind of local museums that attempt to tell their own versions of history complicate the larger regional or national narratives in the larger museums?
Yeah, well, great question. I think it's very different. The relationship between museums and indigenous people in Mexico is completely different from everywhere else in North America, Canada included. And I think that it's just a historical thing that has happened, right? The mestizaje, it was so complete. The historical trajectory of the museums, The fact that really indigenous people are completely disenfranchised politically, they have no power. All those things make for that very different relationship. Just looking at in Canada or in the United States, I mean, they have treaties with the government, so they can point to these treaties, but not in Mexico. So, but that's not to say that there aren't movements and there aren't, just recently they put a statue of Montejo in Merida, and Montejo was a conqueror, and people really, they objected, right? They point to the point that somebody thought they're going to tear it down. It's still there, right? So I don't think those groups are strong enough yet in voicing their opinions, and I don't think they've been welcome enough in the academic institutions to be able to make differences. I studied Mesoamericanos in UNAM, and I think there was one student there who was indigenous, let's say. So I mean that's a problem. It's from all over. And in terms of these wonderful community museums, yes, they're happening. A lot of them happen with the support of the INA. Others happen without a single support from the National Museum Board. And those are the very interesting ones. There's one in Teosuco in Quintana Roo, which is about the war of the caste war, and that's where you can see all these objects that were thrown out of the museum because they didn't want to deal with them anymore, and they sent them all there. But the problem is nobody goes there. So they're off the beaten track. So yes, they exist, but they're not part of the general conversation, which is sad.
Yes, please.
For Irina, I want you to elaborate a little more in this idea of the museums, with the buildings, and they didn't know what to use them. But because I assume that the elites have like a project for the creation of identity, nationality. So what was the role of those buildings? Or why didn't they have clear how to use them if behind there was a political project?
So the thing is, at least in Argentina and another Latin American countries, what you have is they are created for different reasons. Some of these creations are connected with people that already had private collections, and what they want is the protection and the money from the state. So, but it's not something coming from the state, but something coming from the collectors and looking for the protection, just looking for a building. A building is expensive, staff, and well, to have a salary to survive as museum director. And these creations are connected with some kind of lobby and political alliance. And the thing is that when you have a permanent crisis, and this is the situation in Latin America, and not only Latin America, but the alliances change. And you have something creative, because this person deserved this museum or whatever because he had collected, I don't know how many skulls and pottery, and the government changed, and they have to pay the salary, the building, or use that building, which is a state building, for that reason, and they don't know why. Because the reason was not a state reason, but a favor to an individual. And when the circumstances change, this constellation has no reason. And the person in charge of the museum has to justify for the reasons for going forward. And for instance, in the case of La Plata Museum, which is an investment from the government, they changed in 10 years the goals of the institutions, trying to prove that it could be useful for the government, for the state, for the province. And the reasons went from exhibiting the richness of the province to the ability of surveying the country, and finally it was transformed in a public school of science. So, but you see the permanent negotiation for surviving. You don't see from the above a policy for having the museum. So, and of course, you don't have many, in the discussions in the Congress, you don't have never the words national identity. You have, there is that person, and that person deserves what he is asking for. And this is something that, it is there. It is just looking for a less heroic history of the museums.
It's interesting you mentioned the headdress, because I went about 10 years ago with the express purpose to Vienna to reclaim on behalf of the Chicanos in the Americas, and I was just expecting to get arrested and get a little publicity or whatever, and they took me really serious. They were really, really concerned. So evidently there must be some movement that's strong to try to get that headdress back, because they tried to explain to me for about 2 hours why they hadn't stolen it. And anyway, I'm not sure if you can shed light on it. I believe I had heard that some pirates, it never got to Madrid, some pirates stole it on the way to Madrid, and then I think the authorities in Vienna bought it from some pirates. Anyway, that's what they told me.
Really?
That's what
They just were trying to keep you happy, I think, maybe.
Exactly. And I was trying to get arrested.
Okay.
We both didn't get our...
Well, it's a really interesting case, and I don't think that we have all the information on it yet. But unfortunately, there's just no paper trail about these objects, a lot of them. So they don't really know why it got there or how it got there or what Moctezuma's intentions were about giving it to Cortés. If he gave it to him, did he give it to him as tribute? I mean, and that was the most likely scenario. It was, this is tribute. Take it, please go away, right? Because it wasn't the only object that ended up there. But it just, because it's there and because it used to belong to Moctezuma, supposedly, I mean, he probably had lots of these, it's ended up being a symbol of this domination. I really don't think it was stolen in that sense. All right.
Yeah.
As we keep talking about the headdress, Mexican conservators from, have analyzed the headdress and have deemed that it is too fragile to travel. So that whole discussion is, I think, for now put to rest. And they create a beautiful publication on it with all the detailed studies of the construction and the identification of the plumes that went into making them, and they helped also, did a few interventions to help conserve and stabilize the headdress, and so that was a collaboration between Mexico and Vienna, and indeed the Mexican conservators deemed that it was too fragile to travel. So that's, I think, sort of hopefully, but that's...
Okay. There is a lady who wants to talk.
Hello.
Yes,
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting to hear your presentations. I just want to contribute with another point of view that might help make this thing more rounded. In a sense, I was the director of the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City for 4 years. And I was coming from academia, so I was not aware of all the political place and how much a museum is really related to the nation, and as really related to the nation, also to the nation within the context of globalization. And I don't think this is only because it's the National Museum of Anthropology. Any museum has, it's a big enterprise. So you have workers, you have to maintain the collections, you have to clean the floors, you have to have like the security, like it's a cost, and the money, it's a very tough thing to get. And also, I mean, that is on one side. On the other side, because of these costs, at least in Mexico, museums are generally related to the government, not to the nation, to the government. And therefore, they will be in each government different. And so I don't think we can really understand museums in Latin America without thinking of the relationship to government, nation, and I have to say it, the birth of them was in relation to colonialism. Like, how do we as a nation respond to being born out of the conquest of territories that had already inhabitants there? And as the whole continent, we really haven't thought of that in depth, what it means to be the inheritors of that conflict that has never stopped being a conflict. And on the other, like later in modernity, like museums vis-a-vis imperialism. So I just think that we are always, as museum directors, even if we don't want to, we are always connected to these lines of historical change and forces. And most of these issues that we can see that they are like just the way you describe them, their roots are also connected to all those forces. I just wanted to have that.
Yeah. Could I
comment.
answer something to you? Well, I'll try to reunite three different topics from this conversation. First one is to Irina, that she goes back to the so-called trial years, which I think are fundamental, the beginning of the 19th century for the theme of the birth of Latin American museums. What to me is very surprising is that, and I know the evolution also of this, I think in that case we should go back also to study in deep the second half of the 18th century, when most national museums were created in Europe, and ours are reflect to that theme. So first of all, we should pay attention to the second half of the 18th century, the illustration, especially l'encyclopédie, etc. Second, what Adam mentioned, he showed a photograph of a British-style house with a Confederate soldier, whatever. Well, I had the same impression when I was here, maybe 40 years ago, whatever, when I saw the Villa Getty, the Getty Villa. I had the same reasoning. I said, I came here several times, and I had great discussions with the curator of the villa, Giri Frel, a very famous character at that time. And I said, well, why are you Americans? I mean, this is not only not original, this is half Greek in California, in former Spanish and Mexican territory. So I think we should be objective. And whatever you do, private or government, you have to judge it in its own time. Yes, because the same image he had in Mexico, I had it here. And of that is many. The history of museums are plagued with this. When I became very young, national coordinator of the biggest Mexican network of museums, I was always advised two things: not to be a collector myself, because I represented museums, and to be away, if possible, from private collectors, okay? As decades went by, I even wrote, and I will talk about this tomorrow, I wrote a book in praise of Mexican collectors because I think it's fair. I think that Mexico has evolved from that. And you have to understand, in America, in the United States, sorry for saying America, in the United States, Most museums are private. In Mexico, it's different. But that also has a reason. You have to go back to the time we lost half of the territory. We are frontier with an empire, and that takes a whole new perspective. You have to, it's not the same in Argentina and in Mexico. These are different things. So this talks about the richness of what we are dealing with now. These are very complex themes. And in Mexico, one of the interesting things of Mexican museums is that they have always been obsessed with their own patrimony. Mexicans, well, we do have temporary exhibits of the whole world, but we do not collect usually pieces from France or from Germany or from wherever. This is an exception. And that there is something profound in that. First of all, we deal with our own patrimony because historical reasons, and also we are very linked to educational programs a lot. We know year by year, our public today is different from Mexico 15 years ago. We know now that most visitors are from 15 years old to 25 years old. These are places of encounter. So just had to give my opinion about things that are being said here, even though it's not my day. So thank you for your patience. And let me say something about the Getty Villa. Even though I was very critical of the Getty Villa, I am the principal admirer of this establishment. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I came yesterday. Yesterday in Mexico was Mother's Day. It's the most sacred day after Christmas. And I was here. And I believe that the Getty, this private owner, had a wonderful idea that a museum cannot only be a place to show things out. You have restoration, you have good collections, you diffuse knowledge, you're even philanthropic. So don't misunderstand me. I am a real admirer of this institution.
I'm going to change
questions?
the direction a little bit, if that's okay, to Rafael, and I really enjoyed your discussion of this oddly kind of gap in knowledge in this art history. And I wanted to ask you about the role of private collections at the MNBA, and if you could talk a little bit about that, since that would kind of tie in a lot of the different conversations. Are there kind of private collectors that have been a part of shaping this institution, and have they been very important to its kind of current state?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Private collections are obviously hugely important, and I think the real central issue for these museums in Brazil at least, and also in other places in Latin America, as Irina was saying, is a relationship between the private collectors and the state, the government. So often the state will concede something, will acquire a collection, or even build a museum to accommodate a private collection, and then will not, there's no continuity to that. So I think the classic example in the Brazilian case is Castro Maia, who assembled one of the most fantastic collections of the 20th century, endowed those collections, just as the Getty was endowed, and yet after his death, his own endowment was basically pilfered by the state. So today the museums are ruined. They can't support themselves. They belong to the state, and they don't receive money from the state, and they don't receive the private funding that was intended for them. So really we have a very clear instance of a private collector with all the best intentions in the world ending up in a situation where his own legacy is destroyed by a state which is rapacious, to say the least. So I think what we have a recurring problem is what is the nation? What is the state? It's maybe a small point, but in the English language we say nation-state. In the Portuguese language we say Estado-nação. it's interesting the state comes first. And we have this, this is why I cited Ottavio Ianni before, this idea that we don't have nationhood, that we have not formed a nation. So really what we have is the private collectors, we have private interests, people who are passionate or curious or ambitious or whatever, and they're trying to impose their own personal views of the nation. But this is not a collective endeavor, and this never becomes a collective endeavor. So even when the state takes it over, it still remains in many senses private. And I think this is sort of typical of Brazilian history, that the limits between private and public are never clear, and the private is never made to serve the public, quite the opposite. So I think we have this, we have to figure out what we mean by nation, and really to try and understand the nation not as something which is the idea of the state brokering private interests, but really the idea of collectivity and how we can make museums and collections representative of a common shared experience. And this is something we have not, unfortunately, tragically, we have not managed to do.
We are running late. 2 o'clock, we must be here for this second session. So I ask you to forgive us, and we move to lunch now. Thank you for your presence again.